I'm Dr. Vanessa Sinclair, and this is Rendering Unconscious. My guest today is Dr. Mikita Brottman, author, professor, and psychoanalyst.
Well, I'll start with talking a bit about how I got into psychoanalysis, because I know that that's something you ask everybody, and I also like the fact that it's kind of structured like a session, and that one thing leads to another, and it's really free, and there's no questions and answers, because I think that allows for the most interesting kind of conversations where you're jumping around. And in fact, when we talk about the book, like one of the things I want to talk about is all the peripheries and tangents that I get into that I love so much. So I think I would say that I got into psychoanalysis in two ways. One, in that, I feel like it's always the way that I've thought anyway. So it's not really when I first came across Freud and psychoanalysis, it was more like, oh, there's a word for this. So this is how I think. And obviously it wasn't I didn't think systematically in that way, but just in terms, if someone is really interested in the female perspective and they discover feminism, or they're interested in class and they discover Marxism, it was more like, oh, there's a word for this and other people think this way too. I realized that because I tend to think in terms of symbols and metaphors, which I guess is the way that a lot of creative people think anyway, in terms of substitutions, what does this stand for, or what does this represent, and making connections between things, and thinking of language as a sort of magical system where one thing leads to the next, and also thinking of things as there being a repressed, that what you see on the surface isn't all there is, and that there's other things being concealed underneath, and you have to kind of dig them out or find a way for them to come out and find out what's actually going on between the surface. So all of those things were the way I thought anyway. But then when I was at college, I was studying English at Oxford, and there was this, I found an ad that a retired psychoanalyst had placed, that he was willing to see students at no fee who couldn't afford treatment. And I answered the ad and went to see him. But even though I didn't really know what was the difference between psychoanalysis and any other kind of therapy, and I lay on the couch and everything, I just thought that was what you did in therapy, whatever it was. And it was I went to see him 3 times a week, or maybe twice a week after a while, for a long time. And it was really interesting, but it was also really, really scary and difficult, and it was awkward, and I really cared what he thought about me, even though I didn't like him, and all of these strange things went on. And so that's how I first got into it. And then I became really interested in psychoanalytic theory as applied to literature, and part of my PhD was on Lacan, and then through Lacan I got really back into Freud and into the more the earlier aspects of psychoanalysis that I found such much more interesting. And then I went into training when I was in my mid-30s, but I already had a PhD in literature, and I had an academic job, so I wasn't necessarily looking to be a psychoanalyst. I was more kind of enhancing my career rather than changing it. And I thought that combining literature and psychoanalysis would make me a better reader and a better teacher. And then I had no idea of the whole mess I was getting into with training and institutes and competition and technique and all the hierarchies and everything. So I was kind of disillusioned by that. So I trained enough to be certified, but not licensed. So I did it for, I had a private practice for a while and saw patients, and then kind of mostly combined psychoanalysis with teaching, writing, and then I got very interested in like forensic work and working with people in prisons and psychiatric hospitals, and I still do that. So it's just finding the parts that work for me, which I think a lot of people that you've spoken to managed to do in the end, to get away from all that moribund narcissistic hierarchies and away from like the DSM and find a way to apply it in their own way.
And that does bring us to your book.
Yeah. Well, I don't talk overtly about psychoanalysis in the book, I don't think, although I think I referred to the Phipps Clinic but I'm really interested I've always been interested in true crime, and I've always had like a morbid curiosity. And so a lot of my work has been about subjects that other people think of as morbid. But and this strange death that occurred in the building that I live in, and it was like one of those, I've always been into like creepy unsolved mysteries, and it was one of those, but it had like everything bizarre, every bizarre element, every classic bizarre element, from like Freemasonry to, police cover-ups to strange cults. And basically this, I woke up one day, went out to walk my dog, and I saw all these missing posters all over the neighborhood for a guy who had gone missing. He was 32, and he was like 6'4" and really handsome. And I was struck by, first of all, I hadn't seen missing posters for a long time, and I was kind of interested in them, but also how handsome and big this guy was, and so conspicuous. It's not the kind of person that you imagine going missing. And then a week or so later, they found his body in the building that I live in an empty office, and he had jumped or been pushed or fallen from the roof, and it's like an 18-story old building, and gone through a roof of an annex and landed in this disused office. And the body had laid there for a week before being discovered. And it was so fascinating because he had everything to live for, no mental illness, nothing, no suicidal tendencies, perfectly like in a good relationship, newly married, making plans for the future, making plans for that weekend. It's just so inexplicable. And I followed this case for like 10 years, and it's actually still open as a homicide, so it's really difficult to get any information about it. But since the book came out, they're making an episode of Unsolved Mysteries about this case, and in fact, there are people coming tomorrow to look at locations and things. So maybe, and this is what I hope, that like people would get more interested in the case after I wrote the book, and maybe it would be solved, or at least people would kind of come out of the shadows and more information would be obtained, because I was limited in what I could find because I'm not an investigator or not even a journalist or and I'm kind of, I hate talking to people on the phone, and so there was a limit to what I could find. I was more interested in writing about it, but when I read true crime, I'm mostly interested in how, like, I'm not really interested in like the forensics and the ballistics and on that kind of thing. I'm interested in how it reveals more about human relationships and emotions, because those are at the heart of most true crimes anyway.
What do you think about the relationship between kind of psychoanalysis and solving mysteries?
Well, I do talk in the book about the Purloined Letter, Poe's story, and that, I guess there's a big connection between like Auguste Dupin and Lacan and Freud, and yes, getting to the heart of things and solving mysteries. And I think that the most interesting mysteries are insoluble anyway. But I think that most of them, the best way to tackle them is not to go directly at the heart of them, but to go on tangents and just kind of follow your instinct. And so the book people have either loved it or hated it, and that's kind of what I expected. And the people who don't like it, they said, according to the reviews, like they just couldn't even finish it. They'd got a certain way in and they couldn't finish it because they were expecting like a straightforward true crime, and they wanted a mystery and the police work and the details, and every other true crime, it's a genre. And in this, there's a lot of tangents and peripheries, and it's also a part memoir. And I use the crime as a kind of springboard to consider all the other kinds of things I'm interested in, like compulsions, obsessions, death, and why we as human beings are interested in unsolved crimes. And again, that's another connection with psychoanalysis. I feel like certain crimes open up cracks in our experience of the world, and they allow us to see things that we normally repress, like as a culture as well as individuals. And it's really fascinating to get a glimpse down there. And also, as I said, most crimes are committed because of an excess of emotion. And so they allow us to see what I feel like that could be. Any one of us could commit a crime like that if we had the emotions that we have, but just to excess. They're not criminals, they're not a different kind of people. They're me and you, but their emotions have driven them to moments of, losing their temper or envy or greed or longing, lust, despair. These are all emotions that everyone feels, but usually not to such extremes that we're driven to commit a crime. So, but our feelings for each other are writ large in these acts of violence that then become, and I think that's one of the reasons why people are so fascinated by them. There's a quote that I have included in the book that I really like from George Bernard Shaw. When we want to read of the deeds that are done for love, whither do we turn? To the murder column. I think that's really true. That that's where love is writ large in the murder column. And the people who like the book like it because of those tangents and kind of peripheral journeys. There was a review, one of the reviews I really like, even though it's probably not meant to be flattering. It describes it as an odd, slightly creepy book. And Unexplained Death is the kind of book that's perfect for the person who poked at roadkill as a child. And I love that. I mean, I didn't poke at roadkill, but I was that kind of child. A compulsive exploration of the shadowy borders of our collective fascination with unsolved crimes. And I love it when the word creepy is used in connection with it, because I love creepy things myself. So that's what I was going for, creepy and compulsive.
Yeah, I think that's why I loved it, because I loved all of the kind of journeys. I didn't even think of them as tangents. I just thought them as like following the associations. I felt like it made a fuller picture. And I had the experience where, like, once I sat down to read it, I was on a train. I just, like, read the whole thing in one sitting. Like, I just read the whole book.
Yeah, and I like, there are books that I've read where the crime is the heart of the book, but it's also like a catalyst for reflection and analysis and investigation and anecdote. And I guess some people think, like, there's a story and then there's these things that are tangential to the story, and that's never, I mean, I feel like you do, I'm not writing a particular story that has a narrative arc, although I guess in the end it does, but it's more like seeing what's generated by these personal observations, and a lot of the tangents become abstract, and they lead into things like philosophy and psychology and religion and things that people don't think of as playing an important role in true crime. But to me, like I said, the crime is like the starting point for these investigations into everything, really. I mean, there's nothing that's outside the purview of the investigation. And I think that's probably why I don't much like traditional, like, genre true crime, because it usually takes the point of view of the prosecution, and And it usually, it pays attention to things that, like scientific details or forensics and things like that, that I'm not, ballistics, things that don't really interest me very much. I'm much more interested in psychology and the human elements of it, and not so much like the lab work and the CSI stuff.
Yeah, that gets almost fetishistic, I find. People really get into the kind of nitty-gritty of those details. Yeah,
the objects and the trajectory of bullets and things like that. I mean, there was some of that in this, because I did talk to some physicists who worked, like forensic physicists who worked on the trajectory of a fall or a push. Like, how can you tell from someone's injuries when they've been pushed? Or because this Ray Rivera, he landed so far out from the roof that it had to be a running jump, and that was just the implications of that are really interesting, because the assumption is then, well, it has to be a suicide, but maybe not. I mean, maybe there are circumstances in which someone could take a running jump from a building and it's not of their own volition, or they're at gunpoint, or they're trying to avoid something worse. Or, I mean, there are all kinds of other possibilities that are opened up by that. But yeah, the physics itself is not particularly interesting to me, and I don't really have much of a head for figures and details, and I tend to sort of get lost in those things, and I want the psychological elements, the human elements, to come back.
I think something else that's interesting is that you don't often get this perspective. Like, it shows, like, your perspective as someone in a building where this happened, and people don't often think about, like, they think about the person it happened to and the person who maybe committed the act, if it's a homicide, maybe the family members affected, like the children or the spouse or something, but like it affects the neighborhood, it affects the place, and you're like a person that's tangentially involved, like in the space, but not the usual kind of view that someone might see.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, I have a book of short stories called 13 Girls, which is, I took 13 real victims of murder, and I fictionalized the stories, but each one is like a real case, but it's told from the perspective of someone like who might be the therapist, or the girl's best friend, or someone who happened to work with her, or someone who was like in her circle, but not directly involved in the crime itself. And then I wrote about like how they were impacted by it. And sometimes it's not very much, just someone who didn't know the girl very well. She went missing. It was like curious for a day or two, and then gone away. So each incident is like, it's like a stone thrown into water, and it makes ripples, but the ripples depend on, how close you are to the center of the stone, the explosion, really. And if you're way out on the edge, it's a glitch in your day, but no more. So yeah, that's interesting. I actually really like I have a podcast too, and it's, but I'm not on it. I don't speak in it. So I'm really interested in watching and listening to trials and audio of trials and police interrogations and things like that. But I don't like having a narrative, and I don't like having someone edit and explain and filter out and tell me what's important and decide what's important or not. So I just release like a section of audio that I find compelling, whether it's from a trial or a police interrogation or a 911 call, or like something that's in the public domain anyway, but it's unedited, and I just include like an hour, even if it's a trial, like with the sidebars and the off-topic discussions, because to me, again, it's like analysis. Like, those things are really telling, and sometimes they're much more interesting than what's going on, what the witness testimony or the police report. It's the sidebars, or when the judge takes a break, like what people are talking about, and what the audio picks up, or like the chat before the lie detector test begins, or those kinds of things that are not like off stage, those are really interesting to me. And most podcasts that present like true crime, they have a structure and they say, we're going to talk about this case and here's what's important. But I'm not so interested in what's important, and what's unimportant is often more important to me.
Exactly. It's the not sticking with the linear narrative. This happened and this happened and this happened, because all those kind of sidebars or juicy tidbits, they could really open up the story or tell you what's really going on underneath the surface.
Right. And then like the dramatic moments, like the verdict or the sentencing, those are those in advance. I mean, those are pretty predictable anyway. And even if they're not, it's like guilty or not guilty. I mean, there's nothing in between, and they're not dramatic to me. And when they are, I'd rather have those details firsthand than have someone sort of explain to me, what's going on in this case. Sometimes one of the things I like about doing the podcast is it's like curating these bits of audio, because sometimes I'll start listening to a trial or something, have no idea what's going on, who the person is, what they've done. It's still like really interesting to kind of put things together like a jigsaw puzzle for myself. Even the sort of small moments and physical details that are overlooked by most court reporters. I mean, not many newspapers have court reporters anymore, but like just what someone's wearing or the person who's accompanying them, or those are more interesting than like the implications of the legal arguments. What I'm working on now is a story where I know a guy. I used to work in this maximum security forensic hospital, and I kept in touch with some of the people who I knew there. And this is a guy who killed his parents when he was 22, when he was a paranoid schizophrenic. But he's been in this hospital for almost 30 years now. And so it's like the story of what happens after the crime. Most true crime ends where the person is arrested, the perpetrator is found, arrested, and then like they went to prison for the rest of their life, or he was found criminally insane. But usually that's the beginning of someone's life. I mean, most crimes are committed by young men in their 20s. People's lives go on. They have relationships, they have jobs, they develop their personalities. Sometimes they fall in love, and sometimes they're released. It's not the end. It might be the end of the public story, the end of the headlines, but that person's life goes on and they too are a victim in some ways, especially if they were suffering from a mental illness at the time. So I'm writing the story of what happens after, like his years and years in the hospital, which people might think that not much happens in a maximum security hospital, but this guy's had. I mean, he tried to escape. He got away. He was shot by the police. One of his doctors turned out to be criminally insane. There were 2 murders in a single week, patient-on-patient murders, and so much has happened that he's been witness to in this hospital. And he's had a really fascinating life.
No, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
How did you get the idea to do that?
Just from talking to the guy, and I used to have this. I had this reading group, and there was a girl and a woman in the group who was also. She was in hospital she was just being evaluated to see if she was competent to stand trial. And Brian, the guy who I'm writing about, really was attracted to her, and he thought about asking her out, whatever that means. And then he said to me, when I realized, he realized she was only like, I think 18, and he said, I realized that when she was born, I was closer to getting out than I am now, like 18 years ago. And I just thought, wow, I mean, he's really, what have those years been like? And I really wanted to know what it was like to, and I started to get to know men in prison as well who've been in prison for a really long time, and just became, I guess this is taking us back to psychoanalysis. You know, when I was listening to I think it was when you were talking to Todd Dean. Was that the last one you did? Mm-hmm. So did he, was he in APRICU? Because I feel like I used to go to this APRICU meeting since I thought I recognized his voice. And you were talking about like how it becomes just case management and triage when you have, you know, this huge caseload and you have to just use the DSM and you're just like cataloging people basically. And I found that, yeah, it just became like triage. You can't do anything when you have like a big caseload of patients. And I mean, most people simply don't have the time to follow their thought process at leisure. You know, a lot of people who are in therapy just need something immediate, like some immediate concrete help that I certainly was not able to provide. But so I felt like it was more useful if I was going to work with these people to learn more about what the life of someone is like inside a prison or inside a forensic hospital. So, it's just scary and fascinating how difficult and painful life is for the majority of people, actually. But also how much scope there is for improvement and self-understanding, and how just the simple act of talking can be magical and transformative. And if that's the case with an analytic patient, then so much more so in someone who, you know, has been in prison for 30 years and never talks to anyone except their cellmate. And I've been also working at this a sex offenders clinic here and doing forensic evaluations. Almost always men who've been accused of downloading child pornography. And these are, again, it's just fascinating to to go beneath the surface and find out this whole kind of residue of humanity, and people who are scapegoated and who are cast out, and understand things from that perspective, from their perspective, and the things who've done things that most people are horrified by, like rape and murder, and to try to understand and explore the emotions of people who have committed acts like that, because they're not monsters. It's too easy to just kind of dismiss them as not being like us. I mean, as with the true crime, I mean, they are us. They just have the lost control of their emotions, but they're the same emotions that we have.
No, that's a really good point, and that's really important, because even with like recently, like this whole Michael Jackson documentary thing, and people either pointing the finger, and it's like, okay, it's really easy just to go, oh, he's a monster. But like, how did that happen? Like, clearly there's like child abuse, there's other things going on, there's this like celebrity worship and people getting like blindsided by things, leaving their children with him, you know? So it's just like, there's like so many different factors. You can't just point your finger at someone and write them off as saying like they're other or they're different, because this happened, this developed for some reason.
I thought that documentary, I saw the documentary. I haven't heard anything of the controversy, but I really enjoyed that documentary, because I felt like it's very rare that you get a documentary that actually is not simply black or white, but explores what goes on. And as the young men expressed in the documentary, like, you know, they loved him, they adored him, they wanted to be, you know, they were distressed when they were cast out and rejected, and yet it was also child abuse. You know, you can love someone and they can abuse you. I mean, it's not incompatible, and people never talk about the how it's a reciprocal relationship, but it's still abuse. It doesn't mean it's not abuse. I felt like when I was in training, a lot of the time you had to kind of think of that like you're either the therapist or the patient. You're not both. And the fact that you're one or the other allows you to use certain vocabulary and discuss things in a certain way. And it's full of like power relationships. So the patient will have blind spots or take on defenses or deny things or desire things or question things. But it's only because the patient that you're seeing. I mean, we all do these things too. It's just that in the power relationship, in a therapeutic relationship, someone else is pointing them out. But it's not that only patients have them. So, and this I found this a lot in in this forensic hospital. And again, it's like even talking about this, it's really easy to think of like the psychiatrists as the bad guys, which is not true either, because most of them really care for the patients and want to help. But like nobody talks about feeling; they talk about affect, and nobody talks about like feelings about other people. You talk about transferences, and no one is depressed. It's anhedonia, or you're not just like feeling pissed off. It's expressing anhedonic resistances or something, and if you fall in love with someone, it's like boundaries fused, and that's. But a therapist would never talk about falling in love with a patient or having strong emotions for them. That would be kind of taboo and a failure. It would be evidence of failure to say of a patient, "Oh, I really love him," or "I adore him," but you can say it. You just can't say it in those words. You can talk about, "I felt my boundaries becoming fused," or "I had to resist this transference," but it's just a kind of defensive way of talking about the same things. There's very ordinary human emotions, but you're kind of trained not to see patients as your equals, and not to think, well, it could be me in that position. I could be suffering in that way, and perhaps sometimes I do. And also, I think that people start to use that language, and then they start to believe in it, and that's when it becomes problematic. When you stop being aware that you're using these kind of magic words yourself, and you believe in the spell works on you as well as them.
Yeah, and when they just kind of start turning into jargon, like loaded words, but there's not really any thought behind what they actually mean anymore.
Yeah. I think, but it could. I mean, it's interesting to think how like that can be also really positive. The way that words kind of have that magic in analysis. So a diagnosis can be reductive and pointless and stigmatizing, but it can also be really helpful to some people to find that like, oh, this thing has a name and other people have it too, and people know about it and they know what to do, and maybe there's a drug that helps with it, and it can be like the magic word that you discover can be, it's kind of real and it's not real at the same time, because every borderline patient is different, but there are important similarities, and so that it can be useful for both the doctor and patient to know the word. But I think that's what interests me so much about psychoanalysis is like the emphasis on language and how it reminds us that words are magic and that they do cast spells in the world. And that's another overlap with true crime, actually, because in the courtroom, the judge pronouncing that sentence, that is, it's just a word, but it's like someone can be sentenced to death or married or divorced. Those legal words enact life and death sentences. So they do have magic in that sense, in the same way that a diagnosis has magic. Mm-hmm.
How did you end up working in like forensic settings in the first place?
I was on sabbatical for a year, and I set up. I wanted to work in a prison because I'd heard of the volunteering in prisons. I'd heard of other people doing it, and it sounded like an interesting thing to do. And I got in touch with some prison librarians, and I started a book club in a prison. I wrote a book about this too. It's called the Maximum Security Book Club. And so then from there, I did that for like 2 or 3 years, and I another one in a forensic hospital, and then I just got really interested in the patients in the hospital and the men in prison and their lives and their cases, and I just never really lost touch with any of them. I just carried on, even after the book clubs were over, carried on visiting, and I wanted to know what happened, with their cases. Some of them got out of prison, and I'm still in touch with them. And through that, I guess I just got to know like psychiatrists who worked in that field, and got to know the system a little bit, and like how evaluations work, and how like forensic psychiatry works, and just began like dabbling and doing what I could on a voluntary basis, and then started picking up like some paid work.
No, I think that's really wonderful that you do that, because it's a similar thing. Like when I worked in hospital settings, it was some inpatient psychiatric units, but then just like I did consultation liaison services where I'd only see people while they were in the hospital, like for other medical problems. And then I worked in an HIV clinic for 5 years. That was in a hospital, but it was outpatient based. But in all of these settings, it is so different just to speak with people and let them speak and listen and take time, and not have the time be like designated for this evaluation or this form to be filled out or this prescription to be given or this kind of something to be ordered or decided upon, or just to like sit and chat and listen and be aware and really be present with them. It's like nobody did it.
Yeah. And to do it on a basis like you're not a care provider, you're a fellow human being, and you actually have an interest in them as another human being in their lives. Because I guess I feel in some ways like I have an affinity for isolation myself. Like I really enjoy being on my own. And I think in a way, it's almost, I almost have to try to like make sure that I, have some human interaction during the day, that I actually, and that's why it's a good thing, that I go to work, and because it's very tempting to be isolated. And it's really important to remember that the grounding influence of other people, even if you don't necessarily feel like being social, it always helps. It always makes me feel better, and it always reminds me of that, we're sort of all in this together. And I feel how much greater that must be for people who, are living their lives in a cell, or, there's a guy who I talk to a lot on the phone who's in a maximum security prison, and he's never been on the internet, for example. He doesn't know what the internet is. He sees it referred to in TV shows and things. And he was taken from a prison to court and back recently. And he said he glimpsed out of the window, like he said he saw that parking meters had flashing lights on them. Like that's new. Like, what does that mean? What do those lights mean? And just things in the world that we take for granted, like cell phones or a GPS. I have to explain these. It's like talking to someone from another planet. You have to explain what things are, but it's almost like there's this kind of, when you realize how many people are in this position, it's like there's this huge kind of underworld of people who are like kept out of reality and don't deal with money or don't go online or don't deal with like the everyday world, and are living such a limited life in so many ways that don't have, so many people don't have visitors, and it's just writing letters is something people don't tend to do anymore, and it's really it just makes, I know it makes such a difference to people to have someone writing to them and interested in their lives, and so it's really rewarding for me. And I think also our relationship with the external world says something about our ability to love and to relate to other people, and we have to. It reminds us who we are and about our relationship with ourselves, and also I feel like I really love that formulation of Freud's where he talks about the point of psychoanalysis to transform. What is it? Uncommon neurosis into everyday unhappiness, something like that. Because I think that's. I mean, no insurance would pay for someone to be given ordinary unhappiness. I don't think, if you put that on the insurance form. But I think that, that's actually, for many people, that's a lot to ask. Ordinary unhappiness is much better than what they have now. So it might seem like it's a minor feat, but I think it's not just enormous, but it's also truthful. It's really honest. And that's the other thing about that language. I feel like that using that language about anhedonia and boundary fusion is deceptive. It's like it stinks. In some ways, it stinks of deception. It's like armor to protect you from ordinary human feelings and to protect you from acknowledging how similar you are to other people and how much they're suffering. And you can't be seen as like weak or sensitive because that's being incompetent. And I do understand if you have like a huge caseload of really difficult patients, you do want to keep yourself from empathizing completely with every single one of them. But again, sometimes it's too easy to like fall into the trap of believing in that language and thinking that you are separate from them and different from them.
Well, also in the beginning, you said that in your psychoanalysis that you went through Lacan through your dissertation, and then it brought you back around to Freud and all the early things that Freud talked about that you really like. What are those?
Oh, well, again, I think people sort of dismiss these a bit now, but his work on the uncanny and on precognition and like the occult stuff, which some people say that he turned his back on, but I don't think he ever did. He was just he's being pragmatic about it, but like the subliminal self, and the connection between psychoanalysis and like hypnotism and mesmerism and trance states and to myth and folklore, and the way that it links back to all of the kind of stuff that I'm most interested in, which is the areas of the self that we can't normally get in touch with, because I think also that's like it's those cracks in the surface of reality where there when he in his essay on precognitive dreams or fortune tellers or strange coincidences, it seems like there's something in there that's that kind of gate crushes the time barrier, or there's something almost supernatural about it, and Freud's trying to like hedging around it, trying to explain it and trying to make a system out of it, but he can't. And I think that the most interesting unsolved mysteries to me do that too. It's like someone vanishes like while walking down a hotel corridor or something, and like are never seen again. What happened? Where did they go? And it seems as though there's a connection between like it's almost as though they've kind of fallen down a crack in reality and disappeared. And Freud's really he's really got this great sensitivity about those things. There's I can't remember there's an essay where he's reading a book, the Forsyte Saga, and then an Englishman comes to his home who is called Forsyte, Mr. Forsyte, and Freud's writing about foresight and precognition as well. Like the way that language plays into those superstitions is kind of fascinating. And I think it was Jones that talks about him having this kind of pendulum swing between skepticism and credulity. But there are later letters where Freud says, well, if he could live his life again, he would spend it investigating the occult. And I think he's really aware of those strange coincidences and uncanny dreams. And like his essay on the uncanny is just fascinating. The moments where he sees himself in a mirror and like doesn't recognize himself. I feel like they tap into something in the unconscious that's beyond scientific explanation, and it's really fruitful and productive to think about. But nothing can be concluded from it because it's outside of language and consciousness even. It's kind of like it's hard to talk about. It's like trying to talk about a dream when you've just woken up and the dream's there, but it doesn't really make sense because it's outside of language.
You can't really put words on it.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, but you would think, I would hope that as psychoanalysts that we would be open to exploring those kinds of things and letting there not come to a decisive conclusion at the end and just exploring to see where the exploration goes, Yeah,
and that's the difference between, what the people who are on your podcast are able to do, and then people who work in a clinical setting where it's simply like reimbursement, filling in a form, diagnosis, classification, and not exploring and thinking and reading. But I think, I sometimes find myself in this split between this tendency to explore and follow peripheries and then something that immediately needs to be done, like someone who needs to be helped. So, however, I often find that the person might think they want immediate help, but actually a tangent or an exploration can bring about an improvement that the person wasn't expecting or anticipating. Like, we often don't know what we really want, even if we think we know exactly what we want immediately. So it's always good to explore and take the long way around.
Thank you for listening to Rendering Unconscious. You've just heard a discussion with Dr. Mikita Brottman. For more, please visit her website, MikitaBrottman.com. That's MikitaBrottman.com. You can also visit our publisher's website, Trapart.net, and my website, drvanessasinclair.net.
Flames dance, burning nothing. Light to the next section. On days like these, we go home to the old planet, when as a child we felt our roots in space. This is a word for the ignorant, a bliss for the wise. Heads smooth like tantric eggs, I surmise. My priestesses too, and she knows. My priestess is too, and she knows. If ever there was a desert, it is of no response. From the heart we stare to the blessed, my children only. Sometimes I feel so conscious, awake enough to spill a tear or two. Two for myself, two for myself, two for my priestess, two for myself. The great whole goes dark, a vortex as earth eats, falls apart. Each seed ejaculating like the executed, as fools burn glass and dreams we call robes or ego. Dreams we call robes or ego. They're wrapped around us, all ego, all ego, all ego. Do you remember the broken ring, his son, the Hierophant of lead, wiser, dead, wiser, dead, wiser, dead, the Hierophant of lead. I worship all priestess and child. I worship all priestess and child. Burning the old home, burning